Well, good morning and welcome to the Kern Airmanship model in detail, and today we're going to be talking about skill. And this is the third webinar out of a series of 11. And for those of you that are new to the webinar, let me just give you a quick briefing on how to work the system. You see a little white arrow in an orange box should be up on the right hand side of your screen. That collapses or expands your control panel. If you want to send a text message, a question, you can do it in this box, and then you just hit the send button. Or you can raise your hand. This is actually the preferred method of getting my attention, although you can send a text message. And just to make sure everybody's in the loop, why don't you all click on your raise your hand icon now, please. Okay, I see that no icon, no hand for Greg. Oh, there's Greg. Okay, how about Paul? Are you there? Can you hit your raise your hand icon? Okay. You are all muted, so you can't just burst in with a comment, so you do have to raise your hand or send me a text message, and I'll open up your mic for you. This is a Wings program seminar, so you do get 1 knowledge credit for it. And Paul sent me an email here on the last webinar a few days after it was closed out, asking if he was going to get the credit because he didn't see it in his Wings program credit history. And it turns out, at least my experience is, that it takes several days for the system to actually get the credit posted. I put everybody's name in the system as soon as we finish the webinar. But it does take a few days before it's posted, so just be patient. And if it doesn't get posted within a couple of weeks, let me know. One of the webinar sponsors is the FAST team, the FAA safety team, and you know that their purpose is to improve aviation safety. That's why we're holding this webinar. And also to convey safety principles and practices, and of course that's what airmanship is all about. The other webinar sponsor today is the Center for Airmanship Excellence. And I'd recommend that if you have not already, you go to the center's website, go to the Airmanship Archives page, and request a download of the approximately one hour webinars that cover 6 sessions on redefining airmanship, the Kern book, Redefining Airmanship. And it'll give you a better base. What we're doing here today, and with this series of 11 webinars, is going into detail on each of the 10 elements of the Kern Airmanship model. So this would give you a better base if you had already looked at the 6 sessions. So feel free to go there and download them, or I request a download. Also, if you have not yet viewed the Airmanship Development Support Organization Demonstrator Briefing Number 1, that's also available for download, and I'd suggest that you do that. And if you have not already, I highly recommend you register for airmanship updates on the Airmanship Excellence website. That way you'll be in the loop, be notified of events and other information. And the website address is shown here. By the way, in the next few days is going to be a major upgrade to the site, but I will notify everyone who is registered for airmanship updates when that is posted, so that you can go take a look at it. A little more information, a little bit easier to use. Well, here is the 11 seminar series quick overview, just to orient everybody here. Number 1, we looked at an overview of the Kern Airmanship model. In webinar number 2, we took a close look at flight discipline. Today, we're going to look at skill. Next one, proficiency, then knowledge of self, knowledge of aircraft, knowledge of team, environment, and knowledge of risk, and then situational awareness, and the last one will be on judgment. All right, any questions so far? I know we've just gone over the administrative stuff here, but before we get rolling, anybody have a question? If you do, please raise your hand. Hit that raise your hand icon. All right, looks like nobody has any questions at this point, so we'll get into it here. Well, let's review, why are we even looking at airmanship development? Airmanship development provides new challenges, and as you've probably heard me say if you've attended any of the webinars or seminars, we think this is one of the problems in personal flying right now, the fact that we've dropped from 35 million hours a year in the early 80s down to about 14 million now. And we think a lot of that is due to the fact that the challenges have gotten kind of old for those of us who have been flying for a while. You know, the $100 hamburger chase has gotten a little repetitive. So if you have an airmanship development plan and you do it right, you will have a continuous series of achievable challenges that don't take much time to achieve, don't cost a lot of money to achieve. So to keep you interested in flying, but also it will allow you to improve your airmanship. And the quest for airmanship excellence is rewarding. You get personal satisfaction from it. You're rewarded with more capabilities so you can do more things with an airplane. But I think the number one, the most important by far reward that you get for working on your airmanship is that you become a much safer pilot. And that's a reward for you, for your family, for your loved ones, for the people who fly with you, and even for the people who are under your flight paths. The pursuit of airmanship excellence increases safety, because that's what it's all about. You know, 80 to 90% of all the accidents in personal flying now are caused by us, by the pilots, pilot error. Airmanship development will help you to reduce your personal error rate considerably. So it'll increase safety overall, we believe. Airmanship development requires increased flight activity. The only way you're going to get to be, well, let me back that up. That's not the only way. The critical component of improving your airmanship is flying more. There's a lot of ground study too and things like this, webinars that you can attend. So there are a lot of ways that you will work on improving your airmanship, but you're going to have to fly more, or at least regularly. And so that will increase our flight activity, which will help the industry. And increased flight activity will reduce costs. If we, a significant number of us start practicing airmanship development, we start flying more, that means there's more airplanes in the fleet, the manufacturers can spread the cost of their overhead, including their liability insurance premiums over more aircraft, costs should come down. Same thing with support services, so increased flying will help us to reduce the cost, and as we all know, we'd like it to be a little less expensive. Now the big question that I keep asking, but I have decided that this is my go, no-go question before I go fly personally. If I don't fly right, should I fly at all? And as we know, Chuck Yeager said, if you don't do it right, don't fly. And I'm of the same opinion. The whole webinar series, all 11 webinars here that we're in the middle of, are based on Redefining Airmanship, the book, written by Colonel Dr. Tony Kern, and it was published in 1997. Now I noticed that there's some folks here in the webinar today who I don't recognize your names as having attended a previous webinar, so I'm going to orient you here a little bit on who Kern is. He's a retired Air Force command pilot, former professor of military history at the Air Force Academy. He's authored 5 books on pilot performance: Redefining Airmanship, which we're using here for this series, Flight Discipline, Darker Shades of Blue, The Rogue Pilot, Culture, Environment, and CRM, and Controlling Pilot Error, Approach and Landing. All great books. He has a master's degree in Public Administration and Military History, and a doctorate in Higher Education, specializing in Human Factors Training Design. I don't think we could find a better guy to help us to understand airmanship and airmanship development than Kern. I mean, he has put years and years and hours of work into this, getting it organized, documenting the various elements of the overall model, and I think it's just great. I have found nothing in any of his books yet that I would disagree with, which is, as you know, for a pilot to agree with another pilot in almost everything is unusual. And all of the other senior aviators that are involved in this agree with me. So he's the man. Here's my bio quickly. Again, if you have not been in a webinar before, you need to know who's telling you all this stuff. I've got somewhere north of 18,000 hours total. I was a United pilot for 22 years. While I was flying for United, I also flew in the Army National Guard down at Midway, in a helicopter outfit down there for about 10 years. and actually flew in the reserves in addition to that over at DuPage and up at Glenview when it was still open for a while. I was a flight safety simulator instructor and training center evaluator, that means check airman, at Flight Safety Tucson on the Challenger for about 4 years. I've been a FAST team representative for about 1 year, and that's why I'm giving this webinar. That's part of my responsibilities as a FAST team representative, to give webinars and seminars. Of course, all this time that I've been flying, I've been a general aviation pilot for about 48 years now altogether. Started out in general aviation, and I've always flown on and off in general aviation throughout my career. I've been a CFI in airplanes and instruments for 45 years. Came a little late to ground instructing formally, at least getting the certificate. I have an instrument and advanced ground instructor certificates. I currently instruct part-time at Glass Simulator Center out at Aurora Airport, primarily giving recurrent and initial training in high-performance singles and twins. I do that to keep my hand in, keep my head in the game, and to stay in touch with the kind of guys that would benefit from this kind of training. I'm the co-author of the book False Security, the real story about airline safety. Wrote that book with my wife, who's also a professional level pilot. And I'm the executive director of the Center for Airmanship Excellence. I'm one of the founders of the center, and I'm looking for my replacement. So anybody that's interested in taking on the task of moving this organization forward, let's talk. I've highlighted 4 of my experience bullet points here because there are times when I was involved in various ways with airmanship development, safety culture, and safety management systems. I've helped to develop them. I've, of course, participated in them as a line pilot. I've helped to communicate their necessity and how they work within the pilot groups in these various areas. So I'm not just talking from book knowledge from reading Kern's book. I've been involved in these things throughout my career. Well, let's get us all on the same page here by agreeing on a shared definition of airmanship. And this is the one we've been using through this series and with the Redefining Airmanship series. So we want to have a common definition, because if I asked each one of you what you think airmanship is, you would probably have different answers. So James, I see your hand is up. I'll come to you here. Let's run through this definition. Expert airmen possess discipline, skill, and proficiency. Expert airmen have a thorough understanding of themselves, their aircraft, their team, their environment, and the risks they face. Expert airmen consistently, and that's the key word there, consistently display exceptional, another key word, situational awareness, and good judgment at all times. That's the shared definition that we've agreed to use in prior webinars and seminars, and we'll use it throughout this one today. All right, James, I'm going to open up your mic. Go ahead if you have a question or comment. All right, James, do you have a question? Okay. I'm going to mute your mic, James, and I'm going to unraise your hand. So if you do have another question, go ahead and raise your hand. Maybe you're having mic problems. If you are, you can use the telephone to call in, and your notification for this webinar, you got the information how to hook up by a telephone if you don't have a mic on your computer. Otherwise, you can type an email, a text message, and send it to me. And here, Jesus says, Kern's books can be downloaded for free at Google Books. Ah, great. Thank you. Thank you, Jesus. I didn't know that. That's a good resource. A long book, I don't know if you want to read it on computer or print it out, but that's a good resource. All right, let's move forward. Let's review the Kern Airmanship model again, so we're all oriented properly before we launch into our detailed look on skill. As you will recall, if you've attended any of these webinars, the Kern Airmanship model has 3 bedrock principles: flight discipline, skill, and proficiency. And upon those 3 bedrock principles rest the 5 pillars of knowledge: self, knowledge of aircraft; team, knowledge of environment; and risk. And upon those 5 pillars of knowledge rest the capstone outcomes we're looking for of situational awareness, and judgment. And let me say that again in a little different way. Repetition helps. I know this model is a bit complicated at first when you first see it, but after you work with it for a while and get it in your head what the elements are, I found that it's good to use in developing a plan, but also just evaluating current airmanship level, designing training programs, all kinds of things. This is a great model. But here's another way to look at the model. If we practice the principles, the bedrock principles of flight discipline, skill, and proficiency, while always striving for a more perfect knowledge of self, aircraft, team, environment, and risk, we can expect the capstone outcomes of ever-improving situational awareness and judgment. And of course, the judgment up there is what keeps us alive. So this model allows us to have a structured approach to having better judgment. Any questions or comments at this point about the Kern Airmanship model or the definition? Okay, don't see any hand raised. Let me look down here on the text messages. And I don't see any other questions, so we'll move on. Well, here's what we're here for today, to talk about airmanship skill. A couple personal views here. Winston Churchill, I think, had a great quote there's a great quote of one of Winston Churchill's statements that applies, and this comes out of the book, out of Kern's book. There comes a time in every man's life that he is called upon to do something very special, for which he and only he has the capabilities, the skills, and the necessary training. And whenever I read this, I think of engine fire shortly after takeoff. What a pity if the moment finds the man unprepared, right? If our skill isn't up, if our knowledge isn't up, then we're not prepared, and we may not be able to handle that emergency properly. Here's Yeager's personal view on this. Complacency will kill the best of pilots, and complacency is what allows our skills to deteriorate. Know your aircraft, especially the parts of it that can save your life. When I first saw this, I thought it was backwards, because I've always thought I've got to know the parts of my airplane that can kill me, and I guess that's true, but I now agree with Yeager. More important thing is to know the parts that can save your life. And one example here would be if you're flying a Cirrus with a BRS, you better know what the deployment parameters are for that chute, because the couple of people who have tried to deploy it outside those parameters, the chutes failed and they didn't walk away. Everybody who deployed the chute within its deployment parameters walked away. So it's important to know the parts of your aircraft, the procedures and so forth that can save your life. And Yeager says, seek to improve yourself. That's the mark of a true professional. And that's the mark of a true airman, and that includes people who aren't flying for a living. If you are going to fly, do it right. So that's his direct quote that I keep using over and over to drive this point home. If you're not doing it right, as defined by everything we're talking about here, then you probably shouldn't even be doing it. I held a seminar, a Wings Program seminar last night for new airmen. It's called Airmanship for New Airmen. So I had a bunch of guys in a room that were recently got their private pilot certificates, and I had one of them during the discussion after we had talked about this. If you're going to fly, do it right. And he said, well, I can't afford to do it right. So should I quit flying? And I swallowed hard, because we want everybody who loves flying to fly. But the truth is, no, he shouldn't be flying. If all he can afford is an old airplane that's beat up, that he can fly once every 2 or 3 months, he shouldn't be flying. So I'm afraid that's the cold, hard truth. If you're going to fly, you've got to do it right. And one of the reasons for that is, don't forget, Murphy is watching and waiting for the unprepared. And the way you're going to be prepared is to pursue airmanship excellence. Flying requires multiple skills that are developed in and out of formal training. We think that we build our skills when we go through different training programs, and that's true. But if you're not working on building your skills all the time, on every flight, then those skills that you need are going to deteriorate if you don't use them. A good example of this is soft field takeoffs and landings or short field takeoffs and landings. We learn how to do them to get by the check ride, and then usually we don't even practice them after that. And those skills, the skills that are required to perform those maneuvers properly, deteriorate rapidly. So we've got to be developing our skills in and out of formal training. In addition to physical flying skills, excellent airmanship requires communication skills. We've got to be able to talk to ATC, to our team, to our passengers. We've got to be good communicators to be good airmen. We have to have good decision-making skills, and that's what we're talking about here right at the top of the model, the judgment. That's how we do all of these things to make our decision-making skills better. We have to have team skills. As the pilot, we're generally the leader of the team, but not always. If you're flying in an organization that has a flight management hierarchy, then sometimes you have to be a follower in addition to being a leader. So you have to have those team skills. And the most important one is self-assessment skills. As you recall, knowledge of self is the first of the 5 pillars, and this is the hardest one to acquire. But you notice that every one of these things is called a skill. Skills can be learned. Skills can be improved. So these aren't mysteries. We know how to train to improve these skills, and all you have to do is have the discipline to pursue that training so that your skills improve. Logical risk assessment requires the airman to have the skill to self-assess current talents and proficiency. This is a very critical part of your risk assessment process, is assessing your current talents and proficiency, your current airmanship level. And that's a skill, and we can teach that to you, the skill how you self-assess. You have to seek appropriate training as required. And part of that is you have to recognize, be able to recognize when you need additional training, but that's awful difficult. Self-assessment is really tough, and the data from research has shown that it's difficult for us to accurately assess our skills and proficiency. So you really need a mentor pilot, a senior CFI, professional pilot, somebody that can fly with you periodically and evaluate your skills. All of the above skills must be built by all pilots who desire to achieve high levels of airmanship. There's no way around it. Traditional flight training programs build to a predetermined minimum skill level for safe operations. Don't have any problem with that. I'm not knocking schools, current schools. That's how the system has been designed. That's how we've been operating the system. We train to those practical test standards for each certificate, and then we go take the check ride. But that only takes you to the safe level. Unfortunately, after that, let's say, example, you get your private certificate, you're tossed out into the flying environment on your own to make your own decisions and to continuously improve your airmanship. And we all know how that works with most pilots. Typical recurrent training only checks for a minimum level of proficiency. Again, safety, that's how the rules are written. Unfortunately for us in personal flying, the only required, you could call it, they do call it recurrent training, I don't even dignify it with that term, is the flight review every 2 years. And there is no standard for the flight review. Different instructors do it in different ways. Some of them are good, some of them are lousy. And so I'm talking about, and what Kern's talking about here, recurrent training, is formal recurrent training that's designed for your needs to get your skills back up to at least the safe level, but hopefully beyond that. And it needs to be done often enough that it does you some good. A brand new pilot, in my opinion, should be taking recurrent training every 90 days. A guy that's got maybe 500-600 hours of flying time, flies at least 4 or 5 hours a month, probably every 6 months will do it for him. guy with a lot of experience that's flying frequently, probably once a year. So it varies with the individual. These requirements are designed to keep you safe, but not necessarily to help you reach your potential as an aviator. And again, these are standards are set for safety, not to help you to become a really good aviator, an expert airman. Individual excellence requires you to personally manage your own airmanship development. Now, you can find help for that, again, from a mentor pilot, senior airman, maybe an airmanship development support organization, an ADSO, can help you to design and manage your airmanship development program, but you have to personally manage it. You have to make sure you're following your plan. Airmanship excellence requires you to seek continuous improvement. Continuous improvement. This isn't something you do once a year. Remember, it also involves your regular flying. So it's not just training. So it's got to be continuous, but it has to be based on a rigorous evaluation of your strengths and weaknesses. And again, the data shows we're not good at evaluating that ourselves. You need help for that to be rigorous, that evaluation. You must work training into every precious flight hour. Flight hours cost a lot in time and effort and so forth. We put risk into every flight hour. It's just there. There's no way to get it out. There's some risk. So we've got to make it count. And so you have to be thinking on every flight, I'm going to do this or that to keep that skill honed, or to renew that skill, or to get a new skill. It has to be done on every flight. So that's why you need that plan. Many aviators are hesitant to do this, and I would say most aviators in our personal flying segment of the industry are hesitant or just too lazy or don't know that this is what they need to do. So this is a big problem. So for example, practice a back course localizer approach instead of flying a visual pattern if you're an instrument rated pilot. You know, how often do you fly that back course localizer? Not very often, so you got to practice it. Look for the opportunities, plan it into your flight when you're planning your flight. Reaching your potential requires a personal plan of action. Your personal airmanship development plan, that's what we've been talking about. It must be based on an honest and valid self-assessment, and I would say also an assessment from third parties. So you've got to get that mentor pilot in the loop. I don't know about you guys, I've got 3 or 4 mentors. There's always somebody that you can find in your network that will be willing, who's more senior to you, has more experience, that is willing to advise you. However, I have to advise you as a mentor pilot to be very cautious on who you pick. As we all know, pilots that have very strong opinions on any issue, and if you have a mentor that's got a bunch of wrong opinions, then he's going to lead you down the wrong path. Your personal airmanship development plan must be underpinned by a commitment to continuous improvement. So we come back to that because I want to emphasize it and reinforce it. It's got to be continuous if it's going to work. If you think you're going to do this just willy-nilly, part-time, every now and then, don't waste your time and money. Your personal airmanship development plan must be based on a rigorous evaluation of your strengths and weaknesses. Again, reinforcing that. Socrates, the Greek philosopher, said, know thyself. So this idea has been around for a long, long time. Knowledge of self is the first of the 5 pillars of knowledge. So that's why you have to incorporate that self-assessment. Self-awareness is central to skill building and improvement. You have the responsibility to help your mentor pilot identify areas that require additional training. So you can't just say, okay, I've got my mentor pilot, I'm going to fly with him every 3 months, and he's going to tell me everything I've got to do. No, you've got to, after every flight, do a critique on that flight. If you fly with another pilot, both of you critique the flight. What could we have done better? What did I do wrong? What could I improve? What do I need to do to make myself a better airman after every flight? But there is more to skill building than self-awareness. Before we can begin to fully grasp what it takes to continuously improve airmanship skills, It's helpful to understand the 4 levels of skills. So we're getting deeper into these subjects now. So we talked about skill in the Redefining Airmanship series just briefly. So now we're going to start drilling down, and here are the 4 levels of skill. First level is safety. We talked about that. You meet practical test standards, you are safe for the things that you are tested on only, though. So safety is the first level. Second level is effectiveness. Third level is efficiency. And the 4th level of skill is precision. Let's take a close look at each one of those. Level 1, safety. The first level of skill is reached, at least temporarily, by anyone who checks out in an airplane, because that's what you're being checked for. Can you operate that airplane at the minimum safety level? You demonstrate that you can fly the airplane safely, but that's about all you're demonstrating in a normal checkout. All you can say at this point is, I'm good enough to be safe. But this level is the most rudimentary level of skill. It's the base level. Much improvement is ahead if you're a dedicated aviator. Level 2 is effectiveness. The second level comes about when we achieve a basic mastery of the activities required to perform our flying duties. So it's beyond safety now. We don't have to fumble around to do our pre-flight planning. We've got it all in a checklist. We know what to do. And we become effective, which means we can do it in a reasonable timeline. We don't make mistakes on all of the things that we need to operate a flight safely. And here's some examples of the effectiveness level. For an airline pilot, it would be a line check, where he flies with a check pilot out on the line, regular passenger trip, and the check pilot evaluates the line pilot to see that he's at the level of effectiveness, so it's beyond safety. Another example is a military pilot. When they get a mission qualification, then they've reached this effectiveness level. They can perform the mission, so that's another example. In the general aviation pilot, an example would be when you can handle the environments you wish to operate in on your own, then you're effective. So that's a very important part of all of the things we're talking about here, is determining exactly how you're going to use that airplane, what kind of weather you'll fly in, day or night, where you'll go, all of those kinds of things. When you get to the point that you're effective at all of those things, then you're one step beyond safety. Continuing with effectiveness, this is the last level at which you must perform. So that must is important. In professional flying, it earns you a paycheck. In general aviation flying, it allows you to practice your hobby. So you've got to at least be effective. Got to go beyond that safety. Many aviators see little reason to develop additional skills beyond this level. So once you become effective, you got it down, you think you got it wired, this flying thing, you're effective, and you say, well, that's good, I'm good there. But you really need to go further. And motivation to develop beyond this effectiveness level must come from within. Again, if you have a mentor pilot, they can help you to see it, but you've got to decide to do it. Now, level 3 is efficiency. So we're safe and we're effective, but now we want to achieve efficiency. Some aviators seek to develop skills beyond the basics of safety and effectiveness. They seek to fly more efficiently than the standards require. Efficiency requires that you learn techniques as well as procedures. And a good example of this is leaning. That's a technique, and you've got to learn that. And when you do learn that, then you become a more efficient pilot. You fly the airplane more efficiently. Another example might be if you know how to do a direct to with the GPS. By using that feature, sometimes you can cut the corner in the dog leg on the flight plan and be more efficient. So there's all of those kinds of things that are examples of efficiency. Continuing with efficiency, and it means experimenting with new and more efficient methods of operation. Now, experimenting, we don't mean doing dangerous things like, well, let's see here, if I pull that mixture, start leaning it back right after takeoff, I can save more fuel. That would be experimenting to see if you can, but you've got to be careful too. A balance must be struck between pursuing efficiency, because it can quickly become an end unto itself. I saw this at the airline. Guys were so good that they were always working at improving their efficiency. And some of these guys just had, graphs and charts and ideas and theories that they were working on, and they kind of lost track of everything else. It can actually diminish those other two levels of skill, effectiveness and safety. Level 4 is precision and continuous improvement. This final level of airmanship skill is characterized by the few aviators who constantly seek greater precision. If you're flying in a professional organization like an airline, the military, almost everybody is doing this. They're working constantly for greater precision. In private flying, we don't have a tendency to do this. These airmen seek perfection, not as an obsession, but as a continuing motivation for personal improvement. I always strive to be for perfection on every flight. However, the last perfect flight I flew was, never. So you're never going to get that perfect flight, but you've always got to be striving for it. They have refined their self-assessment capabilities to a fine edge, and they analyze every error. When things go right, they ask, how could it be done better? So those are the kind of attitudes, the questions you use for this continuous self-improvement and seeking precision at all times. Continuing with precision and continuous improvement. This level of skill requires maturity and consistent and honest self-appraisal. Few aviators ever reach this level. And if you do, you're going to backslide from it unless you are continuously working at improving it. So I've been there a few times when I'm in that sweet spot of flying just enough and I've got enough time to do all the other things I'm supposed to do, but then it goes away and I have to get back there. So it's a continuously moving target. Understanding the 4 levels of skill helps us to know when we hit a plateau in our airmanship skill development. You can all recall that during your flight training, or any flight training you've taken, you generally hit plateaus as you go through the training. Well, it's the same with airmanship development. It's really like a training program. So you are going to hit plateaus. So if you know these 4 levels of skill, you'll be able to see when you're on a plateau. Okay, you're safe, and you're working to be better and better and better, and you get up to effective, and then you're working and working and working, and you don't get beyond effective. And so now you say, I'm on a plateau. And then, of course, there are some things to do to break out of that plateau and continue your climb. But a plan is required to work through these plateaus. You can't just say, I'm on a plateau and now what? You've got to come up with a plan. We will find ourselves in and out of formal training programs that are designed to hone specific skills. But through our airmanship development, we should be continuously assessing and training ourselves. This is something that in personal flying, a lot of us don't think about. We just say, well, we get training when we're with an instructor. But you can train yourself. You have to be careful what you're doing. Don't do things, try things that you're not confident in doing. We'll talk about confidence in a little bit as a defined thing. So you got to be working on training yourself too. It's not just your instructor. At the most fundamental level, we are responsible for our own training. In other words, we're responsible to have the discipline to go get the training and to make sure it's done right and to make sure we learn what we set out to learn. Airmen should strive to build on successive layers of expertise. So again, the first level is safety. And then we build on safety once we reach it to get to effectiveness. And then we build on effectiveness to get to efficiency. And then we build on efficiency to get to precision. These blocks are not made of concrete, however. There'll be some overlap there as you're moving up the scale. But they do require continuous attention. They require continuous assessment. And if you attended the Redefining Airmanship series, you'll recall that we recommended that you have a journal that you keep with you when you're flying and keep it handy at home to write down assessment issues, questions you have, interesting things you ran across, that sort of thing. You should keep a journal, and that'll help you with that. Aviators are required to periodically meet certain minimum standards to pass evaluations and legally operate an aircraft. However, once these standards are met, the drive to continue to improve your skill often diminishes. Some are simply satisfied to get a pilot's license. Their goal has been met when they pass the check ride. And I think probably all of us have been in this category, at least in the immediate aftermath of our latest certificate. But this is a roadblock you've got to break through. Their motivation to improve is gone once they get that certificate. Competing demands for your time, of course, can cause study habits to be directed to other interests. Whatever the reason, it's an unfortunate fact that once a certain skill level is reached, many of us stop improving. And what Kern has to say about this, when you stop improving your airmanship skills, you have airmanship paralysis. I think that's a good term for it. So you don't want to have airmanship paralysis. Let's talk a little bit about competence, because that's part of skill. And Kern did, I think, a real good job of dissecting what is behind competence, how it works. He's got some things that can help us to evaluate our appropriate competence level. Of course, the big reward for a high level of skill is competence. That's one of the main reasons that we build our skills, is so that we have competence. And in flying, competence is critical. If we are not self-competent, we don't have the right level of competence, we better not even get close to an airplane, let alone try to fly. Like in any other fine motor skill task, however, competence is a prerequisite for success in flying. So we've got to have that competence. Here's a good example. And I've been thinking about this. This is a good way to evaluate whether or not you're operating with the appropriate level of competence. High crosswind landing example here. If you lack competence, if you don't have the right level of competence, it's on the low side, you start thinking things like, I'm never going to get this thing on the ground in this high crosswind. Your jaw's clenched, you get all tightened up, your hands go white knuckle on the yoke, your toes curl up on the rudder pedals, and you get all tensed up. And with that lack of competence, it strips you of the very sensitivity you need to feel the wind and the aircraft, what the airplane's doing. So you've got to be relaxed to do it properly. And competence gives you that ability to relax. Lack of competence gets you stressed, and you don't relax. And your control inputs will be abrupt and poorly timed. The belief that you can't do it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Not a good thing when you're up there in the air running out of fuel, got to get the airplane on the ground, and that strong crosswind's facing you. So lack of competence is dangerous. But now here's the confident pilot in that same high crosswind situation. At the first twinge of apprehension, you use self-talk to quickly stabilize your mental state, and that's a skill. Self-talk is a skill. And if you have your self-awareness, you recognize you're tensing up because of the challenge you're facing, and you say, hey, I recognize I'm tensing up, and you do whatever works for you to relax yourself. So you need to have that skill to be confident. And you stay alert but relaxed, so you're not all uptight. You maintain a watchful posture, and you feel what the aircraft is doing. Now, if you've ever flown with, one more point here, and you apply smooth control inputs in a timely manner. If you've ever flown with a truly excellent, expert airman through a difficult, challenging, high crosswind landing, where that airman is flowing the approach and landing, then that's an example. You'll know what this is all about. That's your picture of what that means. But now we look at the difference here between undercompetence and competence. The only difference between the two is the mental state, competence. Competent pilots have a much easier time staying in control of themselves and therefore the aircraft. If you can't control yourself, you're not going to be doing a good job of controlling the airplane. It lies in your personal approach to training, actually, is where this competence comes from. It lies in the level of skill you believe that you possess. If you have done your best to prepare yourself, then you can legitimately assume you possess the skills that an aviator of your experience level should possess. So this is objective. Competence comes from an objective evaluation and training to know that you can meet that challenge. You know that if conditions are within legal limits, you should have the abilities to meet the challenge. This is at the basic level of competence. In short, you're competent. However, if you have skated through your training, then the nagging doubts of incompetence creep in to destroy your inner competence. Fear is a natural emotion for pilots to experience, although none of us like to admit it. We're John Wayne. Put that Bowie knife in your teeth and fly through the thunderstorm. When we must speak of fear, we usually use words like anxiety, eagerness, or apprehension. Fear is a fact of life in the flying game. No way around it. Now, as you get more experience and therefore your confidence level goes up, your fear threshold is a little higher, but I got to tell you, it never goes away. It can stem from unusual circumstances or lack of required skill. But pilots don't panic, and this is my personal mantra. Been using it for years. I get in a tight situation, I say to myself, pilots don't panic, pilots don't panic, pilots don't panic. And that's how I reduce my stress level and get back in control of things if I get out there on the edge. It might work for you, or you can pick another one. Most pilots understand that fear is something that must be worked through. We're up there in the airplane, we get afraid, our confidence level goes down, and now we can't make that landing. Well, that's no good. We got to work, unless there's another pilot there with us that can take over, you've got to work through that fear, and it must be brought under control. Even mild apprehension can develop into panic under the right circumstances. David Bowie, in one of his songs, says, to overcome fear, we must turn and face the strain. So you have to identify where fear can appear and then train and gain knowledge so that that situation no longer causes fear. But to do all this, you have to have a mature approach to self-assessment and training again, so that keeps coming up over and over. The counterbalance to fear. Only you know what your weaknesses are. Now, that your mentor pilot probably would too, but you're the one that's responsible for knowing it. If you want the magical skill multiplier we call competence, and it really is, you must seek the training to strengthen your weak areas. Competence acts as a counterbalance to fear. Competent pilot mindset equals others have learned to do this, I can too. That's a good way to think about it. This approach is rational, however, only if you have prepared. If you have not, it is a dangerous self-delusion. So now we're starting to dip our toe over into the subject of overconfidence. And there are many dangers attached to overconfidence. Overconfidence occurs when our egos write checks that our knowledge and skill can't cash. Of course, as Dirty Harry said, a man's got to know his limitations. And you've heard this before about piloting, but it's absolutely the bedrock truth. You've got to know your limitations. If you don't, you're going to kill yourself. Some other dangers of overconfidence. Once you have demonstrated certain capabilities, confidence is just justified for those capabilities. So you've got to demonstrate that you have a capability, and then once you do, now you can be confident that you can do that. That's what all that means. Activities that fall outside your demonstrated capabilities should be viewed a little differently, however, and demonstrated capabilities. Modest extensions of your capabilities should be approached with guarded confidence. So if you have to do something that's a little beyond what you've done before, start out with from the base of guarded confidence. You're confident, but you're not quite sure yet, so now you're going to do some more to get your confidence back up to the go level. If a situation is entirely outside your experience, confidence is not justified. So if you've never done it before, if you don't have that skill, don't think you can do it, because you probably can't. It's not justified. And that's where a lot of guys get in trouble. So here's a good example of how to, a logic tree, how to look at this. I think it explains it very well. 10-knot crosswind, no problem. You've done it before. You've done it throughout your training. You've proven you can do that in the private pilot test, check ride. You frequently handle 10-knot crosswind components. No big deal. So you can feel confident. But now let's say the wind gets up to 20 knots. Now we're in that area of guarded confidence, because it's close to your experience. You've been doing crosswind landings in 10 knots. You know the procedures. You've got that crosswind landing technique and procedures down. And if you have an out, like say, well, you know, if I can't land, if it gets too rough down there, or I don't think I've got everything wired, I'll just make a go around and go someplace else and land into the wind. So now you can have guarded confidence if it's just a little bit outside your experience. But let's take it up now, crank it up to a 25-knot crosswind component with low-level wind shear. Pretty tough challenge. In this case, confidence is not justified if you haven't demonstrated your capability to land in that kind of wind. So you would have to totally avoid it. You don't want to be a test pilot and go down there and see if you can do it. That's how guys get into trouble. And as you know, we have about, what is it up to now, 1,200 accidents a year, and takeoff and landing accidents are a huge part of that, about half of the accidents. So this is where I think guys get themselves in trouble with overconfidence. And the cemeteries are full of overconfident pilots who thought they could hack it when their experience or skill did not justify the attempt. Self-awareness, again, is the key to recognizing overconfidence. But this procedure we just talked about, that example of the crosswind, you can use that model to think through anything that you're considering doing and wondering if you are competent enough to do it. All right, at this point, does anybody have any questions or comments? Okay, either you're all asleep or nobody has any questions or comments, so we'll move on. Let's go into a case study. Now, we're coming up on an hour, and if you attend this webinar for at least an hour, then I can give you Wings program credit. We have an interesting case study here, but if you don't want to hang around for it, that's fine. And this webinar is being recorded, and it'll be available for download in the near future, so you can come back and pick up that part of it if you want. So feel free to leave if you have other plans, because I know you're figuring this was about an hour. Although if you read that announcement closely, you'll see that I have indicated that all these webinars will run from 1 hour to 1.5 hours. So we're going to go a little closer to the 1.5 on this one with this case study. Now, you're probably aware of this accident. It was a high-profile accident back in 2006, Manhattan, in a Cirrus. And the pilot was, of course, the ball player, Corey Lytle. Here's the history of the flight. It took place on October 11th, 2006. They took off mid-afternoon, 14:42 Eastern, flying a Cirrus SR-20. It was a personal flight, sightseeing flight, actually. There were only two on board, Lytle and CFI. And they ended up crashing into an apartment building. And there's the aftermath, that picture. They crashed while maneuvering, and it was fatal. So both of them died. And as you'll see, the reason I selected this case study, it has everything to do with Lytle and or the instructor's skill. There were also 3 injuries on the ground, so they just didn't kill themselves. They also hurt other people. Oops. Here's the history of the flight. They departed Teterboro Airport, which is right there in New Jersey, at 14:29, and they were cleared for a VFR departure. According to the ATC transcripts, the pilots acknowledged that they were to stay out of the New York Class B airspace. After takeoff, they flew southeast and climbed to an altitude of 600 to 800 feet. And the NTSB report doesn't say MSL, but of course around there everything's about sea level anyhow. So they were pretty low. At point B here, they turned south down the Hudson, and they remained over the river and descended to 500 feet. The flight continued southbound over the Hudson until it beamed the southern tip of Manhattan. Now, I've never been that low on that route, but I've flown into LaGuardia and Kennedy and Newark and Teterboro many, many times, so I looked down on that route many times. And that's a pretty, you have to be flying a pretty precise flight path. There's a lot of traffic in there. You're below some of the taller buildings, so it's a challenging route to fly. And you can see here they jogged a little bit and they flew around the Statue of Liberty down there. And JFK and Westchester County and Newark radar all showed them at 500 to 700 feet at that point, and then for the remainder of the flight. About 1436, the airplane flew around the Statue of Liberty and then headed northeast up the river, up the East River. And about 1 mile south of the Queensboro Bridge, they started a left turn to reverse course. And that's where they lost it. They crashed into a 520-foot tall apartment building that was 333 feet above sea level. So you can see they were, radar had them flying at about 500 feet. So that's what happened. Now, I've got a couple of short videos that illustrate this a little bit more that I think you will find to be of interest. So let me call those guys up. Oops, I think I just did the wrong thing. Excuse me. Sorry for the ball. Got to do it this way. Now, there's no narration on this, but we can see here, you just saw the crash into the building. It'll come up here again. You can't really see the airplane. If you stare at this thing enough times, you'll see it, but here comes the crash into the building. There it was. So that's what happens at the end of this. They crash into that building. And then here is the NTS, oh, sorry, I did it again. Operator error. Shouldn't try to talk and do this at the same time. Here's an animation that the NTSB put together of the crash sequence. Here they come northbound, northeastbound up the East River. You can see they were not completely over the eastern edge of the river where they could have been, should have been. They were more over the center of this branch. And they start to make their turn, and it's not tight enough. And their judgment, something's going wrong here with their low altitude maneuvering skill, because they're not recognizing that they're going wide on the turn. And they end up, boom, hitting the building. And one last one, some news coverage. Okay. So not only is that a tragic event for the people involved, but it also is a real black eye for general aviation. Every time there's an accident like this, we end up with a big black eye. It's not good. So their lack of skill, we'll see, is what caused this. Let's take a look at the individuals involved here. First was the pilot owner, Corey Lytle. He was 34 years old. Private pilot certificate, but he had just gotten it only 8 months before the accident, so he was a real inexperienced pilot. He had a third-class medical that was current. He had no pre-existing discrepancies, medical problems, or enforcement actions, so he doesn't look like he was a rogue aviator necessarily. He just had that airplane 4 months, so he wasn't very familiar with the airplane. He had 87.8 hours total flight time, and that was all in the last 12 months, so that's pretty good level of flying. He had 12.5 hours in a Cirrus, however, and only 3.9 as a PIC, so I'd call that very low experience level in a Cirrus, and it makes you think about why was he attempting such a challenging flight, flying in that area, flying in those tight confines with only a little bit of time in that airplane. The last 90 days he had flown 13 hours, so that's not too bad, but that's about minimum we think to stay proficient. And in the last 30 days, however, he had not flown at all, so he was already starting to lose those skills at that point. Last 24 hours, 0 flying time. He had only 3 instructional flights in an SR-22, not a 20. He's flying a 20 in the crash, but a 22, between July 11th and 13th of that year. And 3 instructional flights in the Cirrus is way, way under training, and it's in the wrong airplane. Now, they're very similar, but not. It isn't. They aren't exactly alike. His first flight in the accident airplane was on July 20th. Remember, this took place in October, so just a few months before. He was with the CFI. Then he flew the airplane again on July 24th, 2006, without a CFI. He had flown with 6 different CFIs since receiving his private pilot certificate. So that it can be good and can be bad. It depends on what kind of instructors they were. If they were good instructors, then that was good. He got a good spectrum of experience and advice. However, if they were the kind of guys that were deferring to him because he was a star, and they might have just been riding along with him, so we don't know that. He received a total of 11.5 hours of flight instruction in the Cirrus aircraft. Again, I would say this is very low time for doing what he was doing. Most of the flight time was conducted in California, however, and there is no record that he had previously flown in the New York East River Class B exclusion airspace, which is that route he flew there. So he was in unfamiliar territory and flying a highly challenging flight profile with low time in the airplane and low time as a pilot. Sound like overconfidence to you? One previous CFI said he was quick to adapt, conscientious, and checklist oriented. So that's good. Another CFI said, though, he only had average flying skills. And another CFI said he's one of the better pilots. So again, I don't know. You know, we have to take those with a grain of salt. You know, there's that star envy and deferring to people like that. So I'm skeptical about these statements about his flying. 3.5 hours of ground instruction. He had 3.5 hours of ground instruction on Cirrus airplane systems, again, woefully inadequate, including the multifunctional display, so it included the avionics. So way, way under-trained on this stuff. And he got a high-performance briefing, whatever that is. Now the CFI that was along with him, Tyler Stanger is his name. He was only 26, so he was younger than Lytle. And of course, down in that age range, that 7, 8 year difference, 8-year difference is a lot. And again, with Lytle being a star, you know, most times a younger guy will defer to him, the older guy, and especially if the older guy's a celebrity. Stanger had a commercial pilot's certificate issued in 2003, so he's only had that commercial for about 3 years. And his instructor certificate was for airplane single-engine land, multi-engine instrument airplane, and he had yeah, that's what it was there. So those are his ratings. he had an FAA second-class medical that had expired. Now, he didn't have to have the medical to act as a CFI because Lytle was the PIC. But kind of tells you a little bit of something about maybe where his head is at this point. Stenger flew mostly in California, where he owned and operated an FBO. He's not a Cirrus standardized instructor, so we don't know how much Cirrus time he had, but probably not much. The NTSB cannot determine whether or not he was really acting as a CFI during the flight or just a passenger. He had only 861 hours of total time, so for a professional pilot, that's on the low side. In the last 90 days, he'd flown 81 hours, so there again, he should have been fairly proficient, flying enough. Last 30 days, 35 hours. You probably recall the Air Force says the sweet spot on flight time per month to stay proficient is about 30 hours, so he was right in that sweet spot. But he hadn't flown in the last 24, so that's probably good in this case, no fatigue. There was no record that he had previously flown down the East River Class B exclusion airspace. So there again, unfamiliar territory for him in a very challenging flight environment, and they could not determine whether or not he'd ever flown a Cirrus before. So my opinion, he was probably more like a passenger on this flight than an instructor. Here are some recent activities of both of these guys. They were touring New York City during the days preceding the accident. They had met up there, and they and their families were touring the city. The night before, both families dined at a local restaurant and attended a musical. So they were probably out late. There is no information on whether or not they were drinking or whatever. But then they put both of their families on airliners, or they went back to the hotel. The NTSB doesn't say how late they were out. But then the next morning they got up before they flew. Remember, they took off in the early afternoon. The next morning they were up and they took their families out to the airport and put them on flights to California because they planned to fly that Cirrus from New Jersey to California over the coming days. About 10:22 in the morning, Lytle phoned the FBO at Teterboro and told them to get the airplane ready. They were going to come out and fly about 12:30. They arrived at Teterboro right about 12:30, and both were observed obtaining weather data and planning a flight. So that's good. At least they spent some time. They just didn't jump in the airplane and go. They indicated to friends that the intent of the flight was to circle the Statue of Liberty. I think this is a key issue because their planning, if what their friends said is right, their planning was just to fly down the Hudson, circle the Statue of Liberty, and probably then just to fly back up the Hudson to Teterboro. That's not too bad, part of that route. Again, they weren't familiar with it, so I don't know. We don't know how much time they spent studying the route, talking to local pilots. There's no indication they talked to anybody locally about how to fly that route. Personnel at the FBO observed Lytle performing a pre-flight inspection of the Cirrus before departure. So that's good. We have indications that he was being disciplined in his approach to flying. Here's the Met info, though, and this is critical. As you probably already heard or guessed, the winds were out of the northeast at 6 knots at the surface. But they were, I'm sorry, out of the east, I said west. Out of the east, northeast. So remember, they started out on the east side of the river, made a turn to the west, trying to turn south. So they had a tailwind on that turn. Visibility was 7 statute miles. Not great, but certainly good enough for that mission. Ceiling was overcast at 1,800 feet. Again, adequate for the flight. Temperature, 63 degrees. So, density altitude wasn't a factor in the performance on the turn. Dew point was 13, so they were pretty close. That's why that visibility was down to 7 miles. Altimeter, 2990. And the winds at 700 feet, as reported by a jet landing at LaGuardia that had the capability to read that out, at 700 feet was east at 13 knots. So he had even probably, if he was even thinking about the wind out of the east, he thought, oh, it's light. But where he was at, he actually had a 13-knot tailwind trying to make that turn, which is going to change that turn radius considerably. Here's the air traffic control data. As we know, it's complex airspace. You got to fly around Manhattan Island. A lot of distractions, but also a lot of tall buildings and towers and so forth along that route. He was flying near 3 major air carrier airports that's, really densely packed with airline traffic in the area, flying right over the top of them. There are many, many general aviation facilities in the area for both fixed wing and rotary wing airplanes up and down both rivers there, and other general aviation airports around. And he was operating in the exclusion area of the New York Class B airspace, so had a lot of restrictions there. VFR operations are authorized below the Class B airspace surrounding Manhattan Island, where he was flying, so he was not illegal there, he was legal. In designated zones called the Hudson River and East River exclusion area. So he flew down the Hudson River exclusion area, flew up the East River exclusion area, and he was going to fly back down, it looked like, was his plan, because he couldn't climb high enough to have separation, legal minimum altitude over the city, and stay below the Class B. Seaplane and helicopter bases are located in or near these exclusion areas, up and down both sides. Aircraft also use the Hudson River exclusion area to transit under the Class B airspace, so that's very busy. Remember, there was a crash up here a year or so ago between a helicopter and a guy in I think it was a Arrow or something else, a Piper. So, the conclusions from the NTSB report. The NTSB concluded that the accident was caused by the pilot's inadequate planning, judgment, and airmanship in the performance of a 180-degree turn maneuver inside of a limited turning space. So just what we've been talking about here, skill. And they added in judgment, and I would agree that was poor judgment for somebody of his level to attempt that kind of flight without an experienced local pilot that knew a lot about it and knew the airplane too, which he didn't have aboard. We don't know. The NTSB says the planning was inadequate. We don't know that for sure. At least I can't determine that just looking at it, but probably was. NTSB says this accident is a great tragedy in which a pleasure flight went horribly wrong and ultimately cost the lives of 2 young men and 3 people on the ground. NTSB quote also, the pilots placed themselves in a precarious situation that could have been prevented by better judgment and planning. There were no system, structural, or engine malfunctions found, so it was all pilot error. The board stated that the pilots did not aggressively bank the airplane throughout the turn, nor did they use the full available width of the river. I guess this goes back to having good skill at turns about a point. Because to do good turns about a point, you've got to know where the wind is coming from and compensate for it. If they remembered where the wind was coming from, they probably thought it was light, so they didn't have good situational awareness, and they didn't do a turn that was going to work. Probably they would have had to be much steeper early on when they were downwind in that turn, much steeper bank. The radar data also indicated that the airplane was in the middle of the east channel, as we looked at on that one picture, at the start of the turn, as opposed to being over the eastern shoreline of the East River, which would have given him more room. So they, again, situational awareness, he didn't even plan that turn properly. And if you've ever been in that area, you'll know how tight that is in there. It's not much room. In addition, wind out of the east would have effectively shortened the available distance to successfully make the turn, the NTSB said. Finally, the board found that the pilots should have recognized during pre-flight planning or while they were considering flying up the East River, after they were already in flight, that there was limited turning space in the East River exclusion area, and they would need to maximize the lateral distance available for turning. And I think this is a good point. There's no indication that they planned that flight up the East River before they took off. Looks to me like they went down there and circled around the Statue of Liberty and kind of looked up there and said, oh yeah, let's fly up the East River, take a look at that side. And those are the kind of things that get you in trouble, no pre-planning, and again, they had bad situational awareness throughout that whole thing. So, critique. Let's look at the critique and the framework of the bedrock principles, or of the Kern Airmanship model, bedrock principles. Flight discipline. Well, as I mentioned, he did a pre-flight. They got the weather. They were observed during that. So they had pretty good discipline there, but I'm really skeptical of how good their flight discipline was in the air, because they were doing a lot of gawking, I'm sure. It's an incredible view from on that route, and they had probably listening on the radios, a lot of traffic. They had the constraints of the Class B airspace, all of those things, and they're unfamiliar in the airplane. So they had some discipline, but if they would have had really good flight discipline, they would have not flown up the East River. They would have said, "Wait a minute, we didn't brief that. We don't know. We don't have all the information we need to do that safely. We're not going to do that." So their flight discipline broke down. Skill. We've been talking about the skill, and obviously skill was lacking. Proficiency. They both were flying enough to be proficient, although Lytle hadn't flown much, or I think at all, in the last 30 days, as I recall. So his proficiency level was probably down, because being a low-time pilot, not flying very often, probably wasn't very proficient. We don't really know how proficient the instructor was, because we knew he flew quite a bit in the 90 days prior, but we don't know what kind of flying it was. Let's look at the pillars of knowledge. Self. I think that's a clear indication that Lytle was overconfident. Probably the CFI too. So they really weren't evaluating themselves. When they decided to fly up the East River, they should have recognized, wait a minute, that's an impulsive act. That's self, acting impulsively. Got to stop that. Aircraft, again, they didn't have much experience in the airplane. You saw what kind of training Lytle got. It was woefully deficient, in my opinion, so he didn't know his aircraft. Team. Well, if we just look at Lytle and the CFI, I don't think they were communicating very well, or if that CFI sounded like he was sleeping to me. But they did make the turn to the left, so the CFI might not have had a good view of how that turn was going. But still, they did not work together well as a team. The environment, well, where do we start? The flight route was a really tough environment to be flying in. The weather was not great. It was adequate. And all of that traffic and so forth, they were not, either they weren't aware of the difficulty of that environment, or they didn't put enough weight on it. Risk. Well, flying around that area at 500 feet is very risky, because you're going to go in that river. Now, they were flying a Cirrus, and that chute, Cirrus says the chute will deploy in 400 feet, but that's just deploy. It's also then has to decelerate you. So the general recommendation is, figure on 1,000 feet to get it deployed and slow you down. But so that chute might have saved them, but highly unlikely, in my opinion. They probably would have hit the river too hard, even under the chute, the partially deployed chute. And so they were at high risk for that sort of thing. High risk, at least coming down the Hudson, but even over there on the East River, collision. High risk of violating FAR, violating airspace. I mean, this was a high-risk situation. And then we look at the capstone outcomes, situational awareness. I've already talked about that. I don't think they were very situationally aware, probably the whole flight, but definitely that flight up the East River. And, of course, their judgment was definitely flawed, so flawed it ended in a crash, a fatal crash. So that's how we could use the current airmanship model to critique our flights too. Same thing. All right. Are there any questions or comments at this point? We're just about got wrapped up. Just have a couple more slides to wrap it, but we'll take a second here to get questions answered, or if you have a comment you want to make, please feel free to do so now. All right. Well, let's move on. I have some questions for you. Let me just get this up here, the poll questions. First one. Airmanship development can provide me with new challenges. Do you strongly disagree with that statement? Disagree, agree, or strongly agree that airmanship development can provide me with new challenges? Give everybody time to vote. Okay, looks like everybody has voted. I'll close it and share the results. 25% agree, 75% strongly agree. Well, good. Good. I'm glad to see that. And the next question. Oops, hang on a second. A little operator error there. This is a neat system, but you got to hit all the right buttons at the right time or it doesn't work. So here we go. All right, here comes one. Next question. The quest for airmanship excellence is rewarding. Do you strongly agree with that? Disagree with that statement? Disagree, agree, or strongly agree? The quest for airmanship excellence is rewarding or can be rewarding. Okay, everybody's voted. Share it with you. And 25% agree and 75% strongly agree. So good, good. You can see we're all on the same page so far. Third question. The pursuit of airmanship excellence increases safety. And again, strongly disagree, disagree, agree, or strongly agree. All right, everybody's voted. And we've got pretty much the same spread here. Between agree and strongly agree, that's everybody. And next question, airmanship development requires increased flight activity. In other words, you strongly disagree or strongly agree or in between that you got to fly more to increase your airmanship skills. Okay, everybody's voted. And here are the results. Again, strongly agree and strongly agree up there. Everybody is in those two categories. Now here's one that I'm really just I've been saying this, and I just want to see if you guys agree with my logic on this. Increased flight activity reduces cost for all of us. Or I should say maybe at this point could reduce the cost for all of us if we had a lot more flight activity. Okay, everybody's voted. Yeah, that's interesting. So we got 13% disagree with that statement, and everybody else agrees. And again, my logic is that as we increase flight hours, more airplanes are required for the fleet. More airplanes produced, the overhead gets spread over more airplanes, costs come down, other costs come down. So that's a logic path that got me to that conclusion. I can see that most of you agree with that. All right, now here's a question for future webinars in this series. Do you guys like these case studies, or would you rather not spend the time on them? We've had them in both of the or in the prior webinar and on this one, and I can include them in subsequent webinars, or we can just leave them out. So I'm curious to see what you guys think about that. Okay, we still have some voting going on. One more. Okay, somebody's choosing not to vote on this one, so I'll close it. And share it with you. And everybody says yes to voted. So okay, I'll keep including case studies in the webinars. I enjoy them too. Got two more questions for you. Do you think Corey Lytle would have benefited from better airmanship development? Okay, everybody's voted. And 22% maybe, 22% yes, and 56% definitely yes. So I think if you guys voted maybe, the ones who voted maybe ought to think about that a little bit, because you may be missing the point of everything we're talking about here. Because all he got was training. He didn't really get airmanship development. All right, we have, I believe, one more question here. Yes. And I've asked this of you before, but I'm curious, some of you are new to the series, and those of you who have been taking this, I want to see if you've changed your opinion, and how likely are you to pursue a personal airmanship development plan? Okay, everybody's voted. Share it with you. Well, very good. Everybody's likely to very likely, and the majority are very likely to pursue it. Well, I'm gratified to hear that. Okay, that's all of the questions I have for you. So I'd like to remind you to not forget to register for session 4. Remember, you have to register for each one of these sessions on the GoToWebinar website. That's the way the system works. So even if you register over with the FAA, you've got to register on the GoToWebinar site. Here's the contact information for me, so if you have any comments, questions, suggestions, feel free to call me, send me an email, visit the website. So thank you once again for attending today's webinar, and I appreciate your feedback, and I'm looking forward to working with you on the other webinars in the balance of this series.